Carter Roberts, President and CEO of WWF US. And we are here in the Panda Pavilion, as it's fondly referred to, in part due to a partnership with CAP and the Center for American Progress. And we're really happy for that collaboration. I also just wanted to say a few words before we get started. And the words go something like this. In the environmental community, we have been after private sector leadership in conservation and climate change for some time. And there have been moments where the climate community has become obsessed with market solutions to the problems that we face, and with good reason. In Montreal and in Paris, there have been many studies that have talked about the yawning gap that exists between the level of financing we need right now from the traditional sources of monies and the amount that we need to address both loss of biodiversity and climate change. And all eyes turn to the private sector at those moments. WWF for about 30 years has been working with companies on voluntary commitments through certification programs, more recently through the commitments that companies make on climate change. We've worked with a lot of the companies that you know, and we consider those relationships to be one of the best things that we do. But we learned some things along the way about those relationships and those commitments that companies make. One is the best companies are now getting after Scope 1 and 2 commitments in a big way with capital investments, changes in their operations and all of that. But those commitments are like the part of the iceberg that's above the water. The part below the water is Scope 3. And it is the supply chains, particularly that U.S. companies have, that stretch around the world, that touch places around the world that matter, and that touch communities, that touch governments, that touch the ability to get after real progress on climate and loss of nature. And the second thing that is hard, that Scope 3 is harder than Scope 1 and 2. And we're working with those companies on that, and we're making progress, but it's really hard. The second thing that we've learned is that the best companies in a voluntary world are getting after these in a big way. The laggards, which cause a disproportionate amount of the destruction on the planet, will not get after these things unless they have to. And we have learned along the way that while markets are important, they work on Scope 3 and they work with laggards if governments step up to enact the policies that make it so. And it is, lots of studies have been done about the scope of harmful subsidies that are out there in the world, and a lot of the work we need to do is to enact that type of legislation that puts an end to those. And you can go a long way toward closing the gap if those harmful subsidies are removed. But there also need to be incentives for the positive progress that companies make that give them the advantage that they deserve in the market. We have here today some of the real champions of work along that front, where government makes markets work the way they should on addressing environmental damage by enacting policies, particularly trade policies, that prevent the worst from happening and then provide incentives for the best behavior to happen. And I am delighted to have some of the real champions of this work with us today. And I am also delighted to have some real friends on this panel that you're going to see. And in particular, I want to welcome Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, an absolute lion on climate policy, and someone who has all of this work in his bones. Senator from Rhode Island. I want to welcome Senator Brian Schatz from Hawaii, who has been getting after the intersection of nature and climate in a big way for many years. And I want to welcome Senator Tom Carper, from the chairman of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee, the senator from Delaware. We've had a lot of Delaware in this COP, between Joe Biden and all that he is doing and his team, and Senator Coons and Senator Carper. And the small state of Delaware is punching way above its weight on the world stage. And last but not least, I wanted to welcome Sarah Schoenhardt, international climate reporter for E&E News. And she is going to serve as the moderator today. And Sarah, I think I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome, everybody.
Where you can cause the most trouble, Tom. Where you can cause the most trouble.
Okay. Everyone hear me okay? Great. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm Sarah Schoenhardt. I'm the international climate reporter for E&E News, which is part of the Politico media group. I cover mostly the negotiations here, so I'm looking forward to having a conversation about ways that we can sort of deal with some of the challenges that they're discussing in the negotiating rooms. So I'd like to start with you, Senator Whitehouse. You've recently reintroduced the Clean Competition Act. I'm hoping you can sort of tell us a little bit about this bill and what you hope it might achieve.
Yes, and thank you to Brian, who has been a consistent co-sponsor of it and helped craft it from the very beginning. The fundamental fact is that as good as pledges are and as good as ambitions are and as good as intentions are, what we have seen is that if the economic signals are to continue to pollute because you can do it for free and don't invest in renewables and clean energy because there's no reward for it, because there's no revenue scheme, because nobody will pay you to solve their pollution problem because what the hell, we pollute for free. That doesn't work, and that's why I'm at my 6th COP, and we are still increasing carbon dioxide emissions, and we are still increasing methane emissions. We have simply got to align the economic signals with good intentions, or we fail. It's as simple as that in my view. So I've fought for a long time to try to get a carbon price, and of course that's the thing that the fossil fuel industry hates more than pretty much anything, and they've got a bit of a death grip on Congress. But it turns out that if we tariff other people's pollution, and if they tariff our pollution, and everybody tariffs each other's pollution, you end up with a price on pollution. And it's apparently a little bit easier to get us to start by tariffing the other country's pollution first. So A, we're acknowledging that. B, we're responding to the CBAM, which to me is the brightest star in terms of emissions reduction in our firmament right now. If not only, I think, will it cause significant emissions reduction in and of itself, but as Tom and Brian and I know in our lived experience, we're sort of up against a blockade of fossil fuel dark money and influence in Congress. If major industries like steel, aluminum, cement, pharma, chemistry have to pay a tariff to the EU, but with a proper law, we can fix that so they don't have to pay the tariff any longer, suddenly the political equation changes dramatically in the United States. So both the immediate effect of the CBAM as a price signal, and even more importantly, in my view, the knock-on effect of including the UK and whatever we can do in the United States into that, suddenly it opens a pathway to climate safety. And this bill is the effort to do our piece of creating that international carbon pricing regime.
I do want to come back to that a little bit further and have you detail some of the EU policy and how we're working with that. But I'm going to move to Senator Schatz. You also reintroduced a bill recently called the Forest Act. Can you tell us a little bit about that bill, what it aims to do, and why you think it's important?
Thanks for having me. Thanks to WWF, and I really appreciate this. And I'm happy to talk about the Forest Act, partly because, you know, there's a scenario in which, even an optimistic scenario, in which we actually do address the climate crisis, the carbon and methane crisis, but forget about ecosystems. And for those of us who came up through an environmental movement that had to do with protecting special places, I don't want to lose the plot on protecting the most biodiverse, the most spectacular places on the planet. There's a scenario where we could do carbon capture and direct air capture and basically engineer our way back down to an acceptable, 1.5 degrees, but we would still lose our coral reefs and our oceans and our farmlands and our tropical rainforests. And so the reason for the Forest Act is quite simple. The Lacey Act has done a lot of work. The Lacey Act bans the importation of illegally deforested forest products, right, into the United States. There are some implementation challenges, which we continue to have. But the reason it's really not stopping illegal deforestation is that illegal deforestation is driven by the, commodities. So the slash and burn agriculture is not for the purpose of actually taking the wood from the rainforest and turning it into furniture, although that sometimes happens. Slash and burn is for soy and cattle and the commodities that we're purchasing in the United States. Now the EU has basically settled this this year with a law, and our law is very simple. Similar to the Lacey Act, any commodity derived from illegal deforestation is contraband, is not permitted in the United States. If we can get the EU and the United States, we do believe that China is likely to follow, and then we've got most of the market, and the incentive for illegal deforestation will be massively diminished. Debt for nature swaps work, lots of other techniques work, but we really have to break this market. And we finally got a bipartisan co-sponsor on the Senate side. We've had bipartisanship in the Senate, on the House side, but Senator Braun, who is no centrist, he's a very deeply conservative guy in Indiana, is our co-sponsor. So we actually think we can enact this and do something about it. And I'll just leave you with this. I have a 16-year-old who periodically learns about something and then asks me what I'm doing about it. And I was very fortunate a couple of weeks ago. I got the text, and it was like, what are you doing about this? And I said, I'm doing the Forest Act. So I am very pleased that we're in a position to actually do something about illegal deforestation in the Congress in the next year or so.
Always good to get out of trouble with your kids.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to turn now to Senator Carper. You're the chairman of the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works. You have long been a champion of addressing climate change and working on issues around this issue on all fronts. Why do you think now is the time to focus attention on the climate impacts of trade and global supply chains, and what sort of efforts can and solutions can we deploy to try and address those issues?
Most of the markets that we sell our goods and services to around the world are outside of our borders. They're not in the United States. They're in Canada, Mexico, and a lot of other places around. That's why the focus on the trade piece is so important. I want to just back up just a little bit. Abraham Lincoln was once asked, what is the role of government? What is the role of government? And Lincoln responded, the role of government is to do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. That's what he said. The role of government is to do for the people what they cannot do for themselves. When it comes to methane, one of the things that Brian and I, and especially Sheldon, have worked on for a number of years is methane emissions. Methane emissions are 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide in terms of climate change global, 80 times. You heard something called Kigali, which focuses on HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. Those emissions are 1,000 times more potent than carbon. And what we have done is worked on legislation that seeks to phase down the emissions of refrigerants that lead to huge amounts of 1,000 times more potent than carbon dioxide. That's why we focus on methane, 80 times more potent than carbon dioxide. One of the things that government can do in this regard is to provide information to citizens, including companies, that many of them have their own plans in place, what they can do to reduce their carbon footprint. And it involves their supply chain. who they're buying, what involves their processes and so forth. So one of the things the government is doing is trying to provide access to information that enables them to be true to the commitments that they've made. In some cases, individuals would like to be able to spend their money, make their investments, in ways that are more appropriate in terms of climate change, reducing the impact of climate change, if they had the information that would enable them to do it. The government can play a couple of different roles here. One is making sure that we as companies, big and small, and as individual consumers, have the information that would enable us to make smart decisions as we spend our own money. And the other thing is transparency is just hugely important in this. We don't have transparency, we're not going to make the kind of progress on this front that we should. And the government has a responsibility to help make sure that pays. The other thing, have you ever heard the term "make a market"? One of the jobs of the government is to help make a market. When I'll give you an example. When electric vehicles were new, not many people were buying them. This year, roughly 10% of the sale of vehicles are going to be 10%. 10% will be EVs. It's up from almost zero a decade ago. But the federal government began making a market for EVs by buying them. We bought them on the civilian side. We bought them on the military side as well to help make a market. And but in this regard, that's the same can apply. Last thing I'll mention is this, and I'll stop. Hydrogen, clean hydrogen, is a major player, and is punching above its weight. Clean hydrogen can be used to help reduce emissions, carbon emissions from cars, trucks, vans. Think big trucks, buses, and so forth. Clean hydrogen can be used to reduce emissions from utility plants. 35% of our emissions carbon emissions come from our mobile sources. Probably another 25% come from our power plants. Probably another 25% come from manufacturing operations, asphalts, steel mills, and so forth. And asphalt, clean hydrogen, green hydrogen is really, really, really critical. One of the things we're working on right now is making sure as the Treasury Department issues what's called guidance with respect to the way the tax credits are in the IRA on clean hydrogen. We want to make sure that the guidance that actually gets the job done in terms of reducing emissions. Those are some of the things that we're focusing on. And again, hydrogen is hugely important in getting that right. Thank you.
Thanks. I want to pick up on that, idea of emissions-heavy industries and companies, and go back to Senator Whitehouse. You mentioned earlier the EU CBAM. Can you talk about how the Clean Competition Act compares to the EU CBAM, sort of what the obstacles might be to coordinating these different trade policies, especially with the UK looking set to implement something similar? And also, just because we are an international climate space, this has come up with some criticism from developing countries who worry about the implications of CBAM or our trade-related policies on their economic growth and development.
Well, let me start with the second point, and I begin with the proposition that the CBAM, by actually putting a price on emissions, will in fact reduce emissions, and that will improve our pathway to climate safety. And if we fail at achieving a pathway to climate safety, the burden of a planet whose natural operating systems have been compromised or destroyed will fall far more heavily on the people and the economies and the countries with the fewest resources. So if we can avoid that, that already is a climate justice win. Then you add in the fact that it generates revenues, which can be used to support climate justice. Then you dial in the fact that it lifts up clean energy economies and gives a motive to provide the resources to develop clean energy in economies that are facing the most difficulty. And at the end of the day, you can track what we've done in our bill and also create an exemption for the least resourced economies. So there's not only the immediate win of avoiding a climate disaster, but there's enormous opportunity to supplement that with even bigger wins. It is important as we're going through this effort to keep the North Star of climate justice in mind. You cannot overlook that, but it solves a very important climate justice issue, and it creates an opportunity to do even better. So I have zero remorse about CBAM from a climate justice point of view. And what we do is we've tried to make sure that we're compliant with the CBAM. So we would, in fact, offset the tariff for the U.S. We've varied from it in two ways. One, we do have the exemption for the least developed countries. And two, we put our carbon price on the worst performing sectors of an industry. So if you're in the bottom half of an industry in terms of pollution, that's where the charge is. And I think that's a very fair charge, because if you're in the bottom half of your industry, you know perfectly well that it's easy to improve because there's a top half of your industry that is doing that. So those are, I think, the two primary differences, but the purpose is to align in such a way that there's a no tariff arena between the US and the EU. And as you know, the UK is giving strong signals they intend to join. That makes a common no tariff platform, and again amplifies the price signal into those economies and around the world that this business of continuing to pollute for free is over.
Thanks. I'm going to go back to you, Senator Schatz. You know, one measure of success for the Forest Act is how well it would be integrated into trade policy. How does your bill do that? What are some of the obstacles to integrating these trade policies, and can your bill sort of foster international cooperation in countries where deforestation is taking place?
Well, I think the objective is what Tom Carper is talking about, which is to change the market, right? It's to make a market, but really it's to change the market. This would not be a tariff regime. This would just be to make these products contraband. And, I think that a lot of what we do in the Congress is we make the simple complicated. And I have the benefit of having a bunch of people who are smarter than me who work for me, and I have these very straightforward ideas like, hey, tell me our best idea for saving the rainforest, and then a bunch of experts come together. And I love it when they come back with something that I can actually describe to like a 9-year-old, which is, you see what they're doing? They're lighting the rainforest on fire, and then they're growing something, and then we're buying it. And then a 9-year-old will go, well, why are we buying that? I thought we were not for that. And the answer is, we shouldn't buy that. And the real answer is, it's cheap, right? And so we have to make it impossible to import. I mean, it's just as simple as that. I think this is a climate justice issue too. I think this is an indigenous peoples issue too. And the very interesting, and we've gotten a lot of kind of politics making strange bedfellows recently. CBAM is a good example of some sort of protectionist interests, some industrial interests now being kind of in favor of what Lisa Murkowski is calling a foreign pollution fee or something like that. I like the branding better than CBAM. But we now have cattle ranchers in the United States, not traditionally left of center organization. And we have a bunch of paper companies and others who are sick of being undercut by these commodities that are coming into the United States way, way cheaper than we could possibly produce them. So I think the stars are aligned, and I think we may be able to make a law here.
It's a positive closing for that question. Senator Carper, I want to come back to industrial policy. Can you talk about some of the challenges to tackling industrial emissions, and maybe whether you see this as an area for cooperation with other countries or competition?
Other countries around the world know that climate change is real. That argument's been decided, and they know that we've got to address it, and if we want to have a future for our children, our grandchildren. As it turns out, I'm going to answer your question a little different way than you'd expect. There's a lot of gloom and doom around the world on a lot of different things these days. You see it. I see it. We turn it on in the news, and we see it everywhere. There's some good news here as well. And one of the things that I've done, I want to share. 10 years ago, I went to the Detroit Auto Show. And but the Detroit Auto Show, Delaware we used to build more cars, trucks, vans per capita than any state in America. And I went to the Detroit Auto Show 10 years ago. Met a woman named Mary Barra. And Mary Barra was a rising star at General Motors. She's now the CEO. And she's heads the business roundtable. Quite an impressive lady. And that year, 10 years ago, the car of the year was the Chevrolet Volt. And the Chevrolet, anybody here ever buy a Chevrolet Volt here? Chevrolet Volt, car of the year. It got 38 miles on a charge. 38 miles on a charge. I went to call Mary Barr a couple of years ago. I was trying to get her, the folks at General Motors to do a better job of reducing emissions for the cars, trucks, and vans that they were building. And she said, we'll do it, not as fast as you want us to do it, but we're going to go there. She said, I believe in electric. That's where we're going. That's what we ought to do. She said 3 things have to happen in order for us to sell the cars we're going to build, electric cars we're going to build. She said the first thing we need is 300-mile range. 300-mile range. 10 years ago, 38-mile range on a Chevrolet Volt. Today, the electric vehicle is in our garage in Delaware, 300-mile range. 300, we got it. The second thing that she said that they needed at General Motors in order to sell the electric vehicles are going to make is the ability to charge batteries in minutes, not hours. And today, we have Wawas in Delaware. It's up and down the East Coast. Wawa's a great place to buy coffee and all kinds of stuff. And they have, at every Wawa in Delaware and up and down the East Coast, they have charging stations. And they're superchargers. And you can go in there, get a cup of Wawa coffee, and by the time you come out, your battery's almost charged. And we put a ton of money, Sheldon and Brian and I put a ton of money in the bipartisan infrastructure bill to actually build charging stations across the country. And so that's an example of government working with the private sector to address the single greatest source of carbon emissions in our country, our mobile sources. And it's not just government doing it by itself, but government to make a market, to provide incentives, technology, and so forth, and to make sure we have the charging stations out there. It's not all doom and gloom. Climate change we can just sit back and say, oh my God, this is awful. We're all going to roast. I think and Joe Biden sees it as an opportunity to unite people in cause, at a great cause, to saving our planet. And we can do that. And the kind of stuff that Brian and Sheldon and I work on literally every day with our staffs, we're doing that stuff. And the United States, which has been a source of enormous carbon emissions in the past decades, we have an obligation as a nation who's put out probably more carbon than anybody else. We have an obligation to lead by our example. And we are doing that, and we're making kind of investments, harnessing market forces, working with the industrial communities, and making a market. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. I'm going to do a rapid fire round before we open up for a question or two. In 60 seconds or as brief.
I'm sorry, we're senators. We don't do that.
I know.
20
I'm
minute
gonna
minimum.
try and press you on this brevity. What in your mind needs to happen at this COP, or I guess by COP 29, now that it's been decided where we'll be hosting, around transparency and clean trade?
To me, the number one thing is that people need to show up at COPs with full disclosure of why they're here and who they're here for. There is way too much fossil fuel influence, and way too much of it is hidden. We did get the UNFCCC to adopt a rule that you have to disclose your fossil fuel affiliations to show up here. That disclosure runs through the PR department and ends up coming out looking like crap. So we got some of the leading environmental organizations to get together, led by Ceres, but Sierra Club, NRDC, LCV, support from World Wildlife, thank you, to put some structure to that. And we've asked Sarah Raskin, who's the interlocutor with UNFCCC to bake that into her recommendation so that when we next go to Baku, when people show up at a COP, they've got to actually disclose who they're here for. They've got to disclose their fossil fuel affiliations. They've got to disclose how much money they give to fight climate change. They've got to disclose their dark money contributions. They've got to disclose their lobbying, and they've got to be ranked on how bad their trade associations are and how much they give to those bad trade associations so that we don't end up with the good intentions of a COP undermined by the bad intentions of an industry that won't even show up with its badge on, but hides behind other organizations to try to sabotage our work.
I'm going to throw another question in there because do you worry that next year's COP will be hosted in another oil-producing nation?
You know, I think if we build, let's consider that a challenge to build enough transparency and clarity around the COP so that when people show up, we know what they're here for, and the subterranean sabotage is brought to the surface and we can all see it and call it out and work around it. So yes, it worries me, but let's try to figure out a way to rise to the occasion with greater transparency and clarity.
Senator Schatz, did you want to add?
This is maybe a technical point, but I think it's probably worth saying that the COP is a rotating presidency, and we shouldn't begrudge regions for the way they currently make their money. And so, you know, I think that's worth saying. I think the question at hand is who's here and for what, and Sheldon correctly elucidated what we need to do going forward. But I don't want to begrudge the rotating presidency. Otherwise, only clean energy people are going to be talking to clean energy people in clean places, and there's very few places that would really meet that purity test.
Essentially, what every organization that gathers people around climate ought to demand is an audited climate political footprint statement. And I'll tell you who'll be most surprised by an audited climate political footprint statement is a bunch of CEOs and board members who will find out that their corporation is actually up to a lot of no good through trade associations and through dark money expenditure. So the clarity and the transparency isn't just so that we all know, it's so that boards can say, we've been doing what? And put an end to the corporate nonsense.
Well, thank you all for joining us. I know you have very busy schedules.
You want to give me a coffee like you gave you?
I'm being called out. I apologize, Senator. Please close us out.
I could listen to Sheldon and Brian all day and all night. I could, and I do. Let me just say to everybody here, thank you for caring about this planet. Thank you for the way you live your lives, spend your money to make sure your children, your grandchildren are going to have a future. French President Macron has a great saying, and it goes something like this. Planet Earth, he said, this is the only planet we're going to have. There's no planet B. There's no planet. This is it. So we got to make it count. I like to quote a guy named Willie Sutton. And Willie Sutton used to rob banks all over the Northeast 100 years ago, and he finally caught him and put him and brought him before the judge, and you know, the trial and everything, convicted him. And the judge asked me, he said, Mr. Sutton, why do you rob banks? He said, that's because that's where the money is. And as it turns out, with respect to carbon emissions, what we have focused on is where the major sources of emissions, where are they coming from? They're mobile sources. They're coming from our manufacturing operations. They're coming from our power plants, methane operations, including agricultural. And so I think the government has an obligation to find out the truth, share the truth, and so we'll make the right kind of decisions. Maybe one more. People, I don't know who said this, but people may not believe what we say. They'll believe what we do. We're in a position, we're the most powerful, I think, most respected nation on earth. We're not perfect, we make plenty of mistakes, but hopefully we don't make the same mistakes over and over again. But people are watching us, watching our country. Say, you know, we may talk a good game on climate, but when it comes down to it, what are we doing? What are we doing? and share it. And Brian and I and a bunch of our colleagues that are here, one of the things we're going to be doing in the between now and the next COP is making sure that the Inflation Reduction Act, Kigali, with the deal with hydrofluorocarbons, all the climate provisions in the bipartisan infrastructure, people are we actually going to implement what we said? Do we just pass laws, words on a piece of paper? We're actually going to implement them and making sure that we do that in a responsible way. And that's critical. So we look forward to seeing you a year from now. We'll give you a report and see how we're doing. Thank you so much.
And a big thank you to World Wildlife Fund.
Thank you.
I just wanted to close out the session by saying two things. One is I love this session because it's a truth-telling session and getting right down to what is happening behind closed doors, what is happening in the world, between nations, between regions. And the other thing I love about it is it's a solutions-oriented session. One thing I've learned after 20 years in this role is if you keep marching ahead with the same old playbook, you're going to get stuck. And what I love in the tariffs work that Sheldon's working on and the forest work that Brian is working on is these are tactics that in the context of geopolitics that matter and have ripple effects. And so I wanted to thank all three senators for all their good work. And Sarah, thanks so much. I know there's another panel, so don't leave. You have to stay. You cannot walk out of this room. But I just wanted to say it's our great pleasure to host this along with Kat. Thank you.
Thank you.
The Catholic Climate Covenant, we did a lot of lobbying with Senator Braun.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you so much.
We're going to
Please, the rest of the panel come up.
Can you tell me your aide that we should most get in touch with?
Leilani Doctor.
Leilani Doctor?
Dr.
Okay, we're going to jump into our next panel so we can stick to our time. Thanks again to everyone for joining us. We have a great panel of folks who are going to react to some of what the senators were telling us just now. I'm going to introduce everyone, try not to butcher names. Forgive me off the bat. I will start with directly to my left. Sorry, to my right. We have Jujin Kim, who's the founder and CEO of Solutions for Our Climate. Next to Jujin is Jean-V Remy, the director of the Srinath Rampal Center for International Trade Law, Policy, and Services. And at the very end, Jean-Francois Timmers, WWF Policy and Advocacy Lead on Deforestation and Conservation-Free Supply Chains. So as we just heard, the senators discussed sort of the frontiers for clean trade policy as imagined in the different acts, the Forest Act, the Clean Competition Act, and industrial decarbonization policy. I'm going to have you all go around and answer a question. What do you see as the largest obstacles to enacting these policies, and how can we sort of create opportunities around those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I'm so fortunately, it would have been great to laud the senators for the great work they've been doing. I must mention that, I mean, the greatest obstacle here in the industrial sector, decarbonization, is not the industrial sector, but the power sector that has to be utilized to decarbonize the industrial sector. And I must mention that the work that the senators have been doing and all the voluntary things that are coming out from the CSO world have been extremely help decarbonize one of the most difficult areas to decarbonize, especially in Asia, the power sector. The industrial decarbonization efforts have been creating a lot of fissures between the manufacturing industry and the power sector. I remember yesterday in a short discussion with Senator Markey, what he said about the Korea's still lingering on power plants, coal power plants, and what the senators are doing are actually creating a really big gap there. I remember the CBAM discussion, the Renewable Energy 100% discussion, the Clean Competition Act discussion. All of this is going into boardrooms of major manufacturers, and for those who know Korea, we are an export-oriented country. Semiconductors, steel, are different from electricity. Electricity is basically a very isolated product, where you don't really get to trade anything. The people in the power sector, I mean, unless they're under severe competition, are alone. Whereas traders, they talk with Europeans, they talk with Americans, they talk with those from California, and they have a different dynamic. And because of this, I recently joined a meeting with high-level Samsung management, including the Samsung Electronics CFO. 3-hour discussion. 80% of the discussion was about power sector decarbonization. And why is that happening? Why is Samsung talking about power sector decarbonization? It's because of the trade-related activities that are happening now. So this activity, I think, this work here is creating a lot of changes in the industrial sector. It's really teaching the people in the boardrooms of Asian manufacturers. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and want to just be clear and upfront that I'm here both as a representative, I say, from a small island developing state. I run a trade center that looks at trade policy and how it impacts the most vulnerable, especially as part of this broader sustainability agenda. But I'm also here representing a really important cohort of academics. I have one of my co-authors of a VLAR framework that looks really globally at how the trade system needs to reform in order for it to add value to some of these discussions and add value to climate action. But as one of the senators said, more broadly, thinking about sustainability in terms of biodiversity, in terms of how it's delivering justice and equity. And we are part of a consortium of trade sustainability experts that over the last 10 months went into countries and communities all over the world to talk very much about how unilateral measures and trade measures that are being taken in the name of promoting these just outcomes actually need to be more clearly addressed by the existing trade system, because the trade system, when it was created at the WTO all the way back in the 1940s and then sort of remade in 1995 with the other Bretton Woods organizations, made certain assumptions about how trade would raise all standards of living. It didn't look into how these distributive impacts of trade policies, which is about more and more and more aggregation of wealth, right, goods and services crossing borders, how is that actually filtering down to the communities that I represent? So I'm going to talk more. I'm sure there'll be a second round of discussions about how this act and these unilateral measures by the United States that really are, I think, well-intentioned, how they need, I think, to be a little bit more inclusive. And I think the EU CBAM, I heard one of the senators say that it's the brightest star we have. I do not agree. I think there's a gentle provocation in there for the United States as a leader, a very important market, and traditionally a thought leader at the WTO, to learn from what did not go so well with CBAM. And some of the things I want to talk about are the built-in mechanisms for getting feedback from other countries that are actually being disadvantaged by some of these policies because it somehow incentivizes certain types of investments in certain types of countries, and also doesn't really get to some of the issues that we face when we try to export smaller developing countries and smaller industries and enterprises as a result of some of these unilateral measures. So I commend the senators for the work they're doing, but I do have some very specific ideas for how we can achieve the equity across many jurisdictions and not just within the United States that I think would be really pivotal as part of the conversation going forward.
You're right, we will do a second round, and I will come back to you on that question. But Jean Timmers, I'd be curious what your thoughts are on that first question.
So first, yeah, to set a bit the scene, thank you so much for having me here. So I'm living in Brazil since 92, and I've seen so much being destroyed, but not just ecosystems or nature, but also people being washed away by the expansion, massive expansion of commodities for export. And that gives a sense of urgency. Now, that sense of urgency can come from a very easy calculation. So, food systems are emitting a third of all greenhouse gases. And reliable computation, reliable modeling shows that we need to reduce these emissions by 80% before 2030, in 7 years, if we want to have a single chance to reach the 1.5 degree goal. We are talking here about something that makes a difference between a livable and an unlivable world, with a massive impact on the poorest people and on absolutely anyone. But it is also a massive impact on the food systems itself and food security on the planet. So we have 7 years to reduce 80% these emissions. Now, recent projections made by WWF demonstrated that only soy, the cattle, and the palm oil supply chains by themselves are responsible for up to 50% of all the emissions from agriculture. 3 supply chains. And so this is giving us, we need that to stop, and not by 2030. If we want to reach that goal, we need that to stop now. And so we've had a lot of initiatives and efforts, voluntary efforts from companies or platforms, and they made some punctual progress, niche progress, but it didn't change the business as usual at all. And so as Robert Carter well said in the introduction, we need the states, we need the governments to step up. So we see, yes, that it's very, very positive. We have the EU legislation coming in, and I can go in more in details why we believe that's a good thing for some things, even for smallholders sometimes, but also it has challenges. And now the Forest Act. So it is giving a very clear signal. You need to be transparent in your supply chains. You need to be transparent in how you're going to cut these destruction from your supply chains. Now, yes, there are challenges. It's a transition. There are costs of making that transition. Yes, there are challenges how to engage with all the countries, the producing countries, and how to be fair with these producing countries. We see there are also challenges of focusing only on tropical forests, and when you see a rebound effect on savannas and grasslands, especially in northern Cerrado, where you see a steep increase of conversion of the Cerrado, while there is a reduction of deforestation in the Amazon at the same time, and in the same proportion. So, yes, there are really challenges, but it is a game changer. It's a game changer. We see also producing countries now stepping up and making some proposals, like Brazil now just launched a proposal for a fund on tropical forests, and trying to organize with other forest countries to kind of step up and having a more even relationship and dialogue on this issue, and a just retribution for the efforts of protecting these ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to try and do a quick second round and maybe have some time for questions. So I'm going to come back to you, Jean-Yves, on this question of how developing countries are feeling about some of these trade measures like the CBAM. We've heard it come up here at this COP. I know there are real concerns there. Can you talk about some of those issues?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about these issues. I first want to step back a little bit, not too far back, because I know we are on the clock. But we often bandy around this notion of developing countries as if they're a homogenous group. St. Lucia, where I'm from, and Barbados, where I live, is not Brazil, it's not China, it's definitely not India. And I think we need to approach these discussions with some nuance. And I think this is what we really tried to achieve and are continuing to try to achieve through this VLAR framework, is that it has to be inclusive for all. We don't have the market power to leverage a lot of the types of changes we want to see. And we definitely think that the only chance of having an inclusive discussion as far as the dislocations that inevitably are happening and trade tensions arising as a result of each country adopting its own approach to meeting its GHG targets needs to be dealt with, at least at a baseline, at multilateral institutions. So the first thing we would say is countries will do what they need to do, the United States, the EU, China, India, and St. Lucia, to meet their NDC targets in Paris. But where is the mechanism for ironing out the tensions that inevitably arise? It has to be a multilateral institution. And although we see some efforts being made towards more regional and bilateral approaches, and even in the context of regional agreements on carbon and carbon mitigation, we think that a lot of that discussion needs to at least take place at the WTO, because that's the place where countries can talk about the impacts of these various unilateral policies and actually establish the ground rules for the types of standards that will be acceptable when we think of recognizing the efforts of different countries. So India may choose to meet its target by not actually agreeing to a CBAM, but actually doing something internally for its exporters of carbon-intensive products. This is one of the suggestions going forward, that instead of getting its goods adjusted at the border through measures like CBAM, and the UK is going that way, why not keep the revenues in India by charging an export tax? Because one of the problems that we are calling out with CBAM is the monies that are rebated at the border are not being redistributed to the countries from whence the tax is being levied. And so you actually don't have countries being enabled to meet their own targets because we don't have a system in place for redistributing. So the way to avoid that is to recognize that countries can actually take their own measures to fund their own carbonization or decarbonization efforts. So the WTO is a place where we can get equivalence, that's the first E, equivalence across different countries that take different actions to meet their targets. Effectiveness, I know you're gonna stop me. Effectiveness is important as well, but I'm gonna jump to equity, because I think one of the really big E's here is that we need to achieve this equitable transition at different stages of the process. One of the things we are proposing in VLAR is we need to repurpose the fossil fuel subsidies to renewable sources. Renewable sources, renewable energy subsidies. And we in the Caribbean, we don't have the means to provide subsidies. So the question is, once you get these rebates from CBAM, why don't we put it in some kind of fund, another fund? We're getting into fund like exhaustion, and I think we need to have a separate discussion about that. But the question, and especially with loss and damage now, we need to create additional sources of funding to make smaller companies capable of verifying their GHG emissions and their carbon intensity. Because guess what? We don't even have the means to measure our carbon emissions. And so how can we get into the market of carbon credits and carbon sinks that we get value from the international business community for carbon sinks in my region if we can't even measure it? So we're talking at a very basic level for some countries. Before we even begin talking about how to adjust, we need to talk about how to actually get companies and the communities that I represent, indigenous women, small entrepreneurs of 1 and 2 people that want to participate in the new economy so that they can actually be upskilled and upgraded. And that's the conversation we need to have. And that's why I think it's incumbent upon the senators to enable a process where these communities get to feed into the process, to get our voice heard, so that when the benign measures are being put in place, they can be really representative and truly equitable and inclusive. Thanks.
Thank you for that. And you're right. I mean, these are very big, complex, knotty issues. So I could ask you questions for hours, but I'm trying to be equitable with the panelists. I'm going to go to Jujin and turn back to industrial policy. Can you talk about South Korea's progress on industrial decarbonization? And I'm curious what kind of impact the IRA might be having on Korean industries.
I mentioned, I briefly, before, I mean, at first question, at the first question, I mentioned that the climate trade efforts have been making the manufacturing industry demand the change of our monolithic power sector. The IRA is doing a different job. I think a story of one of our oil companies might be a good. I mean, we have 4 major oil refineries. 3 of them have affiliation with Aramco or Chevron. So they're basically all major affiliated. 1 doesn't. And this company has decided to limit its exposure to Scope 3 emissions by deciding no longer to invest more in petchem or oil refinery business. They've been instead investing in batteries. They've been a little bit late in batteries, but fortunately, a war in Ukraine happened, which propped up the oil prices, and they've been losing a lot of money in the battery business, but been able to gain a lot of money from the different energy markets. They've been minus, I think, about $1 billion a year, each year. I mean, the battery company has been minus $1 billion a year. But this year, that flipped. That's been even in that neck and neck because of the IRA. So the IRA has been helping an oil company transition into a battery company, which I think is a positive story. One last thing I think to mention is that there's a lot of trade discussions between Europe and the U.S. I think a good idea for the U.S. government might be to not just to the Atlantic side, but also the Pacific side, because you got 2 good allies there in Japan and Korea, and talk about this with Japan and Korea. Do the same GASA talk with Japan and Korea as well. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I'm going to wrap it up by turning back to agriculture and coming back to you, Jean Timmer.
Yes, and I absolutely subscribe with what John said on equity. I'm living in a country where you see inequalities really sharply, and we see really communities being pressured and expelled and suffering violence through the model that is actually in place. So there is an urgency that is also a human rights urgency there. And as for climate, it's a very low-hanging fruit. When you see all the difficulty that we have to change industrial processes, energy processes, we see here it's just stop to cut ecosystems where you have a lot of space available for expanding or produce better without needing to cut anything. So it's very simple. Why is it so difficult? Well, there is a lot of illegalities in the process, and this illegality doesn't want to appear as linked to specific buyers. So that is a big challenge. Yeah.
Do you think these policies, the Forest Act, that you Deforestation Act, do you think they can tackle those issues?
Absolutely. So how? So it's all about transparency and traceability and transparency. We need to know where things come from. We have the right to know it. Now, the good news is it is feasible to know it, despite all the news or the narrative that try to say that it's not. And we're having very clear examples of that happening already on the ground. And the best examples are joint efforts by governments and the private sector, and also other public sectors and civil society organizations on putting together a database, geographical database, social database, territories mapping, and also tax and trade information, so that you can really put a system. These systems are resilient, they are solid, so there is no excuse of not doing this. Now, it has to be independently verified. You have to have access to the information from from citizens, so that we make sure there is no cheating, there is no laundering. And also, we have to look at the smallholders, and we have to have an active engagement of smallholders. Many smallholders that we've been working are suffering from total unequal relationship with an in-betweener, a buyer, which is the sole buyer of their product. They cannot choose the price. They cannot choose the condition. They're not recognized with their efforts. Actually, traceability in that sense is also make them apparent. They become subject. They become partners and having name and address and a voice in the process of the supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you. And I said we would open it up for questions. I think we have time for two questions. Anyone in the audience have a pressing question? Okay. You want to go ahead and wrap it up? Okay.
So thank you so much. This is so we'll finish up and wrap up. So we initially heard from 3 United States senators about U.S. domestic climate and trade policy, and then here I thought this was an incredibly rich discussion, just exceptional. We heard about the impacts of national energy systems and global investment changes on manufacturing. We heard about the need for a sense of urgency, or the sense of urgency that hopefully many of us have, and the critical nature of transparent supply chains. And then we also heard about the need for nuance and inclusion and understanding of distributive impacts. These are complex discussions. This is a complex issue, but it's a critical issue. Trade is a climate issue, and climate is a trade issue. It's something that should have been discussed at this venue for many, many years. I'm actually quite glad it's here now. The UNFCCC is a good fora for these discussions, and I hope folks took a lot out of this discussion. I want to finish by just thanking these senators who headed out. I want to thank the World Wildlife Fund for being an exceptional partner and an exceptional convener at these COPs for decades at this point. And I want to thank Sarah for being a fantastic moderator, and our panelists, Jujin, Jan-Yves, and Jean, for their great work and their brilliance, and all of you for hanging out with us. So thank you. Oh, and I'm Mike from Center for American Progress, if anybody cares. Yeah.